things in during the day when I can, so it keeps me busy.
Well, speaking of keeping you busy, one of the things that you have been covering has been one of the most interesting boycotts against Israel that there's ever been. And this boycott of Israel is different than a lot of others in that it imploded. And your work and the work of other bloggers have a lot to do with that. Can you acquaint my listeners as to what this is all about?
Sure. Well, the first thing they need to do is they need to understand a little bit of history about boycotts of Jews in Israel. They actually started, the Arab boycotts of Jews started, documented, at least as early as the early 1920s. So whenever we hear about a boycott of Israel, what readers have to keep in mind is this is something that's been going on for 70, 80, 90 years, that these are boycotts of Jews. They're not really concerned about boycotting Arabs in Israel. They're concerned with boycotting Jews in Israel. The more modern, and in fact the Arab League boycott started before Israel was even existed. The Arab League boycott started in 1945 for the purpose of denying Jews a state. The more modern boycott movement, what they call boycott, divest, and sanction, was really a product of the 2001 Durban conference, which was so anti-Semitic that the U.S. actually walked out on it. And we've written a lot about this, and that they were parading around with really Nazi-style caricatures of Jews, passing out leaflets and flyers, and that's where the anti-Israel non-governmental groups got together and decided that they would try to treat Israel as if it were the equivalent of apartheid South Africa, which of course it's not. There's no comparison between the two. But that's where they decided that they were going to paint Israel as an apartheid state at that anti-Semitic 2001 conference. It took 2 or 3 or 4 years before they got themselves fully organized. And then in 2005, a group of Palestinian non-governmental organizations who had been working out of that Durban conference announced a worldwide, what they would call civil Palestinian call for a cultural, economic, and academic boycott of Israel. And that's so when you hear the term BDS, when you hear about them trying to keep SodaStream off of stores or off of TV commercials, that's a current controversy. That is all an outgrowth of these anti-Jewish boycott movements that go back at least to the 1920s. So let's keep that in perspective. The latest wrinkle is that the boycott movement has never really gotten very far in the United States, although it has in Europe. But the latest iteration that got a lot of press is the academic boycott of Israel. A lot of very extremist professors, not law professors, but professors at colleges, who really are on the radical fringe, got together and managed to organize a boycott that they pushed through an organization called the American Studies Association.
Now, just to point out, we're talking to Bill Jacobson of Legal Insurrection and also from Cornell Law University. When you say from the fringe, you had one of the people who was pushing this boycott, an academic who actively supports and defends Joseph Stalin. I mean, so we're not talking, when you say fringe, you're talking fringe.
Right, and I think that's the extreme fringe. I forget the school he was from. He was in New Jersey, I think maybe Rutgers, and he's gotten a lot of press. He actually introduced a resolution at a different organization that was not successful. But the American Studies Association people behind this are some of your most active founders of the academic boycott movement. They paint themselves as post-colonial, anti-colonial, indigenous rights, even though the Jews are the indigenous people in that region. So they're actually very anti-Western, and some of them have even said because we here in the United States are occupying indigenous people lands, that they would boycott U.S. universities if there were ever such a movement. Of course,
they're at U.S. universities.
They're at U.S. universities, and they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. They should be quitting their jobs and moving out of the country if they were intellectually honest, but they're not. So to get back to this, so the American Studies Association, this was last fall in late November, the council, who are very, really radical people, proposed this resolution, and it went to an online membership vote. Now, you have to understand that, part of what happens, how organizations get taken over, it's a matter of who shows up. And people who opposed the boycott didn't show up. So American Studies Association, depending upon which of their numbers is accurate. Sometimes they say they have 5,000 members. Sometimes they say they have 3,800 members. However you count it, only 1,200 people voted. So a minority even participated in the vote. And because the other side, the pro-boycott people, were much more organized, they got 800 out of those 1,200 votes.
Well, like they say, the future belongs to the people who show up. We're under a minute left. We're talking to Bill Jacobson, I should say Professor William Jacobson of Legal Insurrection, and we're going to talk more about him with him about these academic boycotts of Israel in our next. Let's get back to our guest, William Jacobson from legalinsurrection.com, collegeinsurrection.com, and Cornell University. Bill, you were talking about the history of boycotts.
Sure, and so what happened is went to a vote, and depending which number you use, between 16% and 25% of the organization.
And just to pick up for people who might have just joined us, this was a vote of the American Studies Association to boycott Israel. A small amount of people showed up, but because a large amount of people who were on the fringe showed up, all the fringe people showed up, they managed to carry the day on that vote.
That's right. So between 16 and 25%, depending which total membership number you use, actually voted for this, and that was enough to pass it. And it was immediately hailed by the boycott movement as an enormous breakthrough, as a huge victory. But a funny thing happened on the way to that victory, which is as soon as it passed, there was a fairly massive pushback by what I would call American civil society, which said that, we don't really care, frankly, that Palestinian civil society wants to enmesh our academic institutions in their boycott, that it is a violation of academic freedom, and it's actually anti-educational to be boycotting other academic institutions. And it's particularly troublesome that they've singled out Israel, which in all of the Middle East has probably the freest and most, academically free institutions anywhere, and that the singling out of Israel was extremely troublesome. So as of this date, I believe the head count is 219 university presidents have issued statements against the boycott. The American Association of University Professors, which has close to 50,000 members, more than 10 times what the American Studies Association has come out against it. The Association of American Universities, which represents, I think it's 62 of the largest universities, has come out against it. The American Educational Association, I may have that name slightly wrong, but a large group which represents virtually every higher educational institution in the country, I think it's 1,700 or something like that, has come out against it. There's been widespread condemnation. Charles Krauthammer wrote a brilliant piece in the Washington Post against the boycott. And so what has happened is that what they thought was going to be their huge victory, that this would create a steamroller effect, that they'd be able to roll throughout the country, actually has backfired on them. They are now pariahs. They are now really ridiculed. And I think in the end, they've achieved their resolution, so that they have this little resolution that they can pass around. But the fact of the matter is that it was a wake-up call for those of us who oppose the boycott, and who particularly oppose the boycott as it relates to academic institutions. So it's a good indication of how they went too far. They tried to use tactics that unfortunately work in parts of Europe, particularly Britain, where there's a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of anti-Israel fervor, and they thought it would work here, and the reality is that it doesn't work here, because the one unifying issue in the United States, it doesn't matter if you're Democratic or Republican, the one unifying issue is support for Israel. And that's what they mistook, that we're not Britain, we're not some other European nation, and we're certainly not the parts of the world which are very anti-Jewish. And so it backfired on them, and I think we're going to continue to push back, and you'll be hearing about those in coming months. We're not stopping now. I've already filed to challenge the American Studies Association's 501c3 status, because I don't believe a 501c3 can become a participant in an academic boycott. They can express their views, that's for sure. They can hold conferences, they can hold seminars, they can write papers about how bad Israel is. But once they stop being an educational charity and become a boycott charity or boycott group, they no longer entitled to tax-exempt status. There may be other lawsuits that people have talked about because the boycott is discrimination on the basis of national origin, that they only, while they don't boycott all Israeli academics, they only boycott Israeli academics, and that's national origin discrimination. And we're going to be, it hasn't been really publicly announced till now, but we're going to be going around the country, and wherever they meet, we're going to insist that universities and that municipalities apply their local anti-discrimination laws to these events. That if they're going to hold an event that's going to discriminate on the basis of national origin, we want the laws enforced as to them, just as they would be to any other group. So it's going to be an active year, and like I mentioned, legal insurrection tends to take a fairly active approach to issues. We don't just write about them, we actually pursue them, and we're going to be pursuing them for the coming months and maybe the coming years.
Now, given that these people are uniformly from the left and supporters of the administration, what are the odds that you think that Eric Holder and the IRS, which has been so zealous in protecting the rights of opponents of this administration, are going to actually make this a priority?
Well, I don't think you should view the people who are behind this necessarily as Obama supporters. One of the things that's very clear here is a lot of the people who have come out against the boycott are your traditional mainstream liberals. A lot of the people who have come out against the boycott are people who may be critics of Israel, but feel that this is totally inappropriate. So this is really a unique issue, and I don't think you can categorize this the pushback against the boycott in the traditional political structures that we're used to looking at things. I don't expect Eric Holder to get involved. There's no reason he necessarily would be, but I do think that there are civil remedies and there are local officials who have to apply their local public accommodation laws, who have to apply their state accommodation laws and state discrimination laws. So I don't know that there's necessarily a role for the federal government. What the IRS does with the challenge to their status, is anybody's guess. But I don't think on this one you can simply say that the people who are behind it are the Obama supporters and the people who are against it are anti-Obama. That's just not the way to look at this. And in fact, the people behind the boycott are truly anti-Western and in many ways anti-American. They view U.S. as a colonial state. They view us as illegally occupying Native American lands. So when I said that these are the radical fringe, I really did mean that. These are not what you and I might refer to as your traditional liberal outlook. So I don't know how this plays out politically. I do know that 134 members of Congress of the House of Representatives signed a letter denouncing this boycott. Half of them were Republican, half of them were Democrat. And so this is truly something that cuts across party lines. And I, for one, don't want to portray it as pro or anti-Obama because that's not what it is.
Okay, well, Bill, we're just about out of time for this segment. We are going to be back with our last segment with Bill Jacobson right after this week's commentary from Gary Goldman. This week, he's going to be talking about the Postal Service and Staples should be a very Jacobson of Legal Insurrection, which is legalinsurrection.com. If you don't go there once a day, you're missing out. There's just no other way to put it. You're missing out on some of the best conservative thought and theory, plus some great cartoons. And today, actually, a little bit of a homage to the professor from Gilligan's Island was there today, which was kind of cute. I want to go back to you, Bill, and ask this question. At the National Post, Rex Murphy referenced the failed boycott campaign against Israel. And for a long time, we keep hearing about Israeli speakers being boycotted or bullied off of campus and stuff. We've been hearing about this for a while. This is really the first, at least to my mind, the first real big reverse we've had on this subject. Is this really because this became noticed, or is it just because they overreached, or is it some of both?
Well, I think what you have to understand is that they have been trying for years to get their boycott achievements. So the American Studies Association, they planned it for 4 years, literally 4 years. And then the people who opposed it within the organization only realized what was going on about a month before. But by then it was too late to really do anything. And in fact, the people who control the organization would spread to the membership all these very hostile anti-Israel materials, but would not allow people to they would not distribute counter materials. So this really was a classic example of how a relatively small group of radicals can take over an organization. I mean, it's almost a textbook example. They get themselves on the right committees, then they control the committees, then they control the board, then they push it through, and they control the process. And it's really a textbook example. But I don't think it has any traction because anti-Israel sentiment in the U.S. has no traction. According to Gallup, most recent Gallup survey, and they've been doing this for whatever it is, 20, 30, 40 years, who do you sympathize with more, Israel or Palestinians? The gap is larger pro-Israel than it's ever been. So the boycott movement, what people have to understand, it hasn't taken off in the U.S., but not for lack of trying. They just have switched strategies. And I do contrast this with Europe. I mean, in Europe, there's a rising tide of anti-Semitism. You can't wear a yarmulke on the streets of Paris. You can't be a pro-Israeli speaker in London without getting shouted down or worse. So I do contrast the U.S. with Europe. In Europe, this boycott movement has really gained a hold. I won't say it's predominant, but it has gained a hold because of the underlying anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic sentiment, much of which is fueled by the Muslim communities in Europe. That's just a fact. And so they don't really have a base within which to operate in the U.S. other than on some campuses, and that's because there are a number of professors who are anti-Israel and supportive of this boycott movement. So they have a base of support. They have professorial support. In fact, I know we're short for time, but one interesting anecdote is, I don't know if you remember, a few months ago, Ray Kelly, the police commissioner from New York, was shouted down at Brown University. They wouldn't let him speak, these protesters. And two of the professors who came out in support of the protesters, I started to do a little research on. And sure enough, those two professors are big boycott supporters. So the connection between the radical left and the boycott movement is very tight. But it really, in U.S. society, only exists for the most part on campuses. But it's not predominant, and it's really limited to certain campuses. So it hasn't taken off. It's not successful. But it is the sort of thing that I think needs to be watched and needs to be countered.
How important and how much of their success really comes from people either not noticing, not wanting to fight back and get involved? I mean, just they're so loud. Who wants to deal with these people?
Well,
is that really what it is? Because look at what happens to Pam Geller when she tries to put on her, they'll have the pro-jihad stuff on the subways and such. She puts on the anti-jihad stuff, and suddenly it's discrimination. It's amazing.
Well, I think on the campuses, I think you're dead on that. A lot of the students just don't want to be bothered. I mean, the anti-Israel groups, they'll set up their table and they'll have all this horrific rhetoric, this defamatory rhetoric that Israel's an apartheid state and so on, and they shout and they're loud and they're intimidating. And I think most people just want to walk by. They don't view it as their battle to fight. And to some extent, the other side is much more organized. I mean, these are all coordinated activities. They've been doing it for years. They're very professional. The people who are behind it, who support it, the organizations are very well funded. Believe it or not, a lot of the funding comes from European governments who either don't know or don't care what these non-governmental groups are doing. And, it's most people on campus just ignore it, but sometimes you can't ignore it anymore.
And, and I think it's important not to ignore. I think it's sort of like the broken glass theory of criminal enforcement. If you allow glass to be broken, then things are going to get bad. And if you don't allow, but if you crack down on this stuff early, then worse crimes don't happen. Like in my own neighborhood yesterday, you had people running down the street, one of them with a gun, getting ready to pull out a gun. And it's because if you don't enforce this stuff, if you don't crack down on this stuff when it starts and it gets a foothold, then it just grows because people, you can always find a reason for inaction. Inertia is a very powerful thing.
I think that's right, and I think that's why the pushback has been so intense as to the American Studies Association, because a lot of people woke up and said, my God, we've been asleep at the wheel for a decade while these people have been organizing and coordinating and manipulating, and now we realize what's on our doorstep and we're not going to let it go any further. And I think that's why you've seen this enormous reaction, both from what I'd call American civil society, from American political society, that no, what is going on with this group is not going to be tolerated. I mean, they're entitled to their opinions and to express them, but when they move from those expressions of opinion to boycotts, discriminatory boycotts, that's not something that we have to tolerate.
All right, Bill, we've got a few minutes left before the top of the hour and that we have you. I want to, not that this has not been a great subject, it is, but I want to know what other cool things are going on at Legal Insurrection that people should check out, and can you give the address of the site that you run so that people can find them and find out more about all the stuff you do? Because
Sure.
you do more than just this stuff.
That's right. This just happens to be one of those issues we've seized upon in part because of my own personal interest in it. But we have people who write about a wide variety of political issues. As you mentioned, we have the guy who I think is the best political cartoonist out there, or at least very close to Ramirez, Tony Bronco, and he's really excellent. And so the web address is legalinsurrection.com. If you misspell it, that's okay. You'll probably get to us anyway. And collegeinsurrection.com. And those are our websites. And, we, are happy to have people come by, comment. It's pretty easy to register. We don't use those third-party things like Discuss and so on, so you have to register for our site. We also have a very active Facebook page. Again, you can just search for Legal Insurrection, and I'm sure you'll find it. And the other issues, we cover, like I said, a variety of issues. We were at the forefront of covering the Zimmerman trial. We had live coverage every single day during the trial, and we followed up with that. We follow up with a lot of Second Amendment and gun-related issues. And obviously, Mandy Nagy is very good at following things related to
Mandy Nagy's awesome. Yeah. We got to get her on the show.
Yeah, hacking and that whole anonymous community, we cover that very extensively. So, there's a lot of different things. I think it's fairly hard to pigeonhole us as to what we do.
Well, Bill, I got to say again, you do great work, and people need to be aware of it. And where can they find you on Twitter, by the way?
Again, it's just Legal Insurrection. If you just search Legal Insurrection Twitter, you'll get to us. I think our technical address is LEG and then the word insurrection, or maybe it's legal and then insurrect. I can't remember. But, we are on Twitter. We've got a fair number of followers there, and we're pretty active on Twitter, on Facebook, on the blog. And like I said, I couldn't do it myself. We've got great people helping out.